The Boy Who Shattered Silence. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 7A burst open with a thunderous bang, sending a jolt through everyone present. The prosecutor, mid-sentence, stopped abruptly, his words swallowed by the gasps that rippled across the gallery. Reporters instinctively leaned forward, their pens poised over notepads, eyes wide with the anticipation of breaking news. In the gaping doorway stood a teenage boy, no older than 15. His dark skin glistened with sweat, and his school uniform, once neatly pressed, was now rumpled, as though he had run all the way here. His scuffed sneakers squeaked against the polished marble as he strode down the aisle with purpose, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted in defiance. He stopped directly in front of the bench, staring up at the imposing figure presiding over the case. "You've lied long enough." The boy's voice rang out, clear and forceful, echoing through the cavernous chamber. All eyes snapped to Judge Thomas Alcott, who sat frozen, his usual composed demeanor cracking at the edges. His black robe draped heavily over his broad frame, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he studied the boy. His fingers twitched near his gavel, but he made no move to call order. The teenager took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he clenched his fists at his sides. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, he declared, "On your son." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The air, once filled with the droning arguments of the prosecution, was now charged with the weight of a single revelation. Judge Alcott felt the world tilt. He had faced some of the most high-profile cases in the state, had sent criminals away for life, had upheld justice with unwavering integrity. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as the words reverberated in his mind. "On your son." For the first time in his career, Judge Thomas Alcott didn't know what to say. A ghost from the past. A murmur spread through the courtroom, hushed but urgent. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. The jury members exchanged bewildered glances. Even the defense attorney, who had been bracing for the judge's ruling in the ongoing financial fraud case, now looked on with wide eyes. "Order," Thomas finally managed, though his voice was barely above a whisper. The bailiff stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son, you can't just." The teenager jerked away, his voice rising. "My name is Jamal Carter. My mother was Gloria Carter. She told me the truth before she died. She said you're my father." The name hit Thomas like a wrecking ball. Gloria Carter. It had been over 15 years since he'd last heard that name, yet the syllables slashed through time like a knife through silk, tearing open memories he'd long buried. His throat went dry. He tried to summon reason, to dismiss the claim, to steady his trembling hands. But the boy's face, his eyes, his stance, all sent a strange, unsettling familiarity coursing through him. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, glancing warily at the reporters. "Perhaps we should clear the courtroom." "Let him speak," Thomas interrupted, his voice hoarse. He barely recognized it as his own. Jamal dug into his worn backpack, pulling out a sealed envelope. With a sharp motion, he tossed it onto the prosecutor's table. The thick paper slid across the surface, stopping just inches from Thomas's bench. "That's my mom's letter," Jamal said, his voice quieter now, but still laced with the raw edges of grief. "And there's a picture, too. You can't hide from the truth anymore." The bailiff tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, kid. Let's go." Jamal didn't resist this time, but as he was led toward the door, he turned back one last time. His gaze bore into Thomas's, filled with something deeper than anger, something desperate. "My mom believed in you," he said, his voice cracking. "She told me you were a good man." Then the doors closed behind him, leaving behind a courtroom filled with silence and an envelope that suddenly felt like it contained Thomas's entire past. A world unraveling. Judge Thomas Alcott sat in his private chambers, staring at the sealed envelope on his desk. The courtroom had since emptied, the financial fraud case all but forgotten in the wake of Jamal's outburst. His assistant, Carol, had tried to ask if he needed anything, if he wanted to talk, but he had waved her away. Now alone, he traced the edge of the envelope with a trembling hand. Could it be true? Memories, long buried, stirred like ghosts. He had been a young man then, ambitious, driven, determined to carve his place in the world. He had attended countless fundraisers, charity events, social gatherings, networking at every opportunity. But Gloria Carter, the name tugged at something deep, just beyond his grasp. With measured breath, he reached for the letter opener and sliced through the envelope's seal. A single sheet of aged paper slid onto his desk, its edges slightly frayed. Gloria's handwriting, small, neat, deliberate, filled the page. Thomas, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means Jamal has finally found you. Thomas swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the letter. I never wanted to keep this from you. Not really. But I had no choice. I did what I had to do to protect my son. And I hope, one day, you'll understand why. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply before continuing. Jamal deserves to know where he comes from. He deserves to know who you are. And more than anything, he deserves a father who will choose him. Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears. His gaze flicked to the small photograph tucked into the envelope. He picked it up with reverence, holding it beneath the desk lamp. It was an old picture, grainy, slightly faded, but there was no mistaking it. Gloria Carter, smiling at the camera, stood near a hospital fundraiser's fountain. The same fundraiser where he had once been a guest of honor. And in her arms, swaddled in a navy blue blanket, was a baby boy, Jamal. A boy who had grown up without a father. A boy who had stormed into a courtroom today, demanding the truth. A truth that Thomas was no longer certain he was ready to face. The question that changed everything. The hours passed in a blur. Thomas read Gloria's letter over and over, searching for a detail, a crack, a reason to doubt. He combed through his memories, trying to reconstruct that night, the fundraiser, the conversations, any moment that might explain how his life had intersected with hers in a way he had forgotten. Had they been together? Could he have fathered a son and never known? The possibility made him sick with guilt. And yet, another, darker question loomed in his mind. What if Gloria wasn't telling the whole truth? What if there was something more, something buried even deeper beneath the weight of her words? Thomas exhaled shakily and reached for his phone. Carol, he said when his assistant picked up, find me the best DNA testing facility in the state. I need results as soon as possible. His voice was steady, resolute. If the past had come knocking, then he had no choice but to answer. And he would start with the truth. Shadows of the past. The night air hung thick over the city, its usual symphony of distant sirens and honking cars muted under the weight of Judge Thomas Alcott's thoughts. He sat in the dim glow of his study lamp, staring at the letter once more, fingers tracing over the fading ink of Gloria Carter's words. Jamal Carter. A boy who had stormed into his courtroom, thrown his world into chaos, and left behind a trail of questions that refused to be ignored. Thomas rubbed his temples. His carefully structured life, a life of control, of law, of certainty, was beginning to unravel at the seams. And he had only one option: find the truth. Digging for answers. By morning, Thomas had already taken the first step. A DNA test. He had called in every favor, used every connection, and expedited the process. He wanted, needed, the results as soon as possible. Now, as he sat in his chambers of the courthouse, he turned his focus to something else. Gloria Carter. If she had been telling the truth, if Jamal really was his son, then why hadn't she contacted him sooner? Why hadn't she tried to reach out for support? If she had known he was Jamal's father, why had she let him grow up struggling instead of seeking help? And most importantly, Why did she wait until her death to say anything? Something about it didn't sit right with him. Gloria Carter. That name felt like a whisper from another life, one he had long since left behind. Determined, Thomas logged into his private judicial database, one reserved for judges and high-ranking officials. It provided access to every legal record, from police reports to court proceedings. He typed in the name. Carter, Gloria. No active cases, no criminal history, no lawsuits. Thomas frowned and scrolled further. There had to be something. Then his breath caught. A single entry. A sealed domestic violence case. Date: 16 years ago. Plaintiff: Gloria Carter. Defendant: Jonathan Alcott. Thomas's blood ran cold. John, his brother. The brother's shadow. Jonathan Alcott, the younger of the two Alcott boys, a man who had always walked the razor's edge between charm and chaos. Thomas had spent his life pulling John out of trouble, only to watch him run back into it. But this was different. Thomas clicked on the sealed case file, but the system denied him access. He scowled. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to bury this. Even as a judge, he couldn't break confidentiality without official authorization. But he had other ways. Thomas reached for his phone and dialed an old contact. Detective Hartman, a gruff voice answered. "Bill, it's me," Thomas said, rubbing his eyes. "I need a favor." Hartman sighed. "Damn, Tom. Haven't heard from you in months, and now you're calling me before 9 a.m. This better be good." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I need information on a sealed case. Domestic violence. Victim: Gloria Carter. Defendant: Jonathan Alcott." Silence. Then a low whistle. "Your brother? Jesus, Tom. What the hell are you into?" "Just find what you can," Thomas said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Please." There was a pause. Then Hartman grumbled, "Give me a few hours." Thomas hung up, his fingers drumming against the desk. His brother. What had John done to Gloria? Why had she run? And if John had hurt her, why had she told Jamal that Thomas was his father? The puzzle was getting more complicated by the second. Jamal's truth. Meanwhile, across town, Jamal sat on the edge of his cot in the youth shelter, his fingers tracing over the photograph in his hands. His mother. Smiling, vibrant, full of life. It felt wrong, unreal. The woman in the picture wasn't the same woman he had watched wither away in a hospital bed. The mother who, with her final breath, told him to find Thomas Alcott. His father. Jamal's fingers clenched around the photo. He had spent years wondering who his father was. And now the answer had come crashing into his world like a wrecking ball. The judge. A man who lived in a completely different world. A man who had never been there. Jamal's jaw tightened. His mother had always told him to be strong. She had raised him to never let the world break him. But this was different. This wasn't just about the truth anymore. This was about why. Why had Thomas left? Why had his mother never reached out? Why had she only spoken the truth on her deathbed? The anger simmered beneath Jamal's skin. His entire life, he had been running. From landlords, from shelters, from his mother's past. But this he would not run from. If Thomas Alcott was his father, he owed him answers. And Jamal intended to get them. Confrontation. That afternoon, Thomas sat in his office, staring at the phone. Hartman had just sent him a message. "Call me. Found something." Before he could dial, there was a sharp knock at his door. Thomas sighed. "Come in." The door swung open. Jamal. The teenager stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He was still wearing his school uniform, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His posture was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. "Jamal," Thomas started. "I was actually about to call." "Save it." Jamal's voice was tight, controlled. "I want answers, and I want them now." Thomas met the boy's gaze, seeing the fire behind his eyes. Gloria's fire, the same determination, the same defiance. "What do you want to know?" he asked evenly. Jamal threw the photograph onto the desk. It was the same one from Gloria's letter, the one of her holding him as a baby. "You knew her," Jamal said. "You knew my mom, didn't you?" Thomas picked up the photograph, running his thumb over its worn edges. "Yes," he admitted. "I did." Jamal exhaled sharply, his shoulders tense. "Then tell me, where the hell were you? If you knew her, if you knew about me, why weren't you there?" Thomas opened his mouth, then hesitated. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? "I didn't know," he said finally. "Not until you walked into that courtroom." "Bullshit." Jamal's hands curled into fists. "She told me before she died. She said you were my father. That means she had to have known for years." Thomas leaned forward, his voice steady. "And if that's true, then the question is, why didn't she tell me?" Jamal blinked, caught off guard. "You said she always told you the truth," Thomas continued. "So why would she wait until the very end to tell you this?" Jamal opened his mouth, then closed it, uncertainty flickering across his face. Something inside of him wavered, because deep down, he had wondered the same thing. He had spent nights lying awake, replaying his mother's last words, questioning why she had never mentioned Thomas before. And now, staring into the eyes of the man who was supposed to be his father, Jamal felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt. Thomas studied the boy carefully. "I need to find the truth, and I want you to help me." Jamal frowned. "Help you? How?" "I think there's more to this story than either of us realize," Thomas said. "And I think it starts with finding out what really happened to your mother." Jamal hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said. "But if I find out you're lying to me?" His voice hardened. "I walk away." "For good." Thomas nodded. "Fair enough." For the first time, they weren't just strangers. They were allies. And together, they were about to uncover a truth that neither of them was ready for. The buried truth. The city was alive with the hum of late afternoon traffic, the low chatter of pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens in the background. Inside Judge Thomas Alcott's office, however, the world had gone deathly quiet. Jamal sat across from him, his posture tense, fingers twitching over the edge of his backpack. The confrontation was over. For now. But the tension still lingered between them, like the aftershock of an earthquake. Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his mahogany desk. "Jamal, if we're going to do this, if we're going to find out the truth, we have to start with everything your mother left behind." Jamal frowned, gripping the strap of his backpack. "There's a box," he admitted. "Mom kept it hidden. Said it had important stuff in it, stuff she wanted me to have when I was older." Thomas felt a flicker of something in his chest, anticipation, dread, maybe both. "Where is it now?" Jamal hesitated. "At our old apartment. In a storage unit downstairs." Thomas nodded, already reaching for his car keys. "Let's go." The apartment that time forgot. The sun had begun to set by the time they reached the rundown apartment complex on the south side of the city. The building was old, the paint peeling off the walls, and the scent of dampness clung to the air. Jamal led the way through a dimly lit hallway, stopping at a rusted metal door at the far end. "We used to live in 3B, he murmured, almost to himself. "After Mom got sick, we had to move to a shelter. I came back once, but I couldn't go inside." Thomas placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone." Jamal exhaled and nodded. The landlord, an older woman with a cigarette hanging from her lips, unlocked the door for them. "Storage units are in the basement," she said, eyeing Thomas warily. "You a cop?" "Judge," Thomas corrected. She scoffed. "Same thing." Jamal didn't wait for further conversation. He pushed past her, leading Thomas down a narrow staircase to a row of metal lockers. He stopped in front of one marked with peeling white numbers, 17B. "This is it," he said, pulling out an old key from his backpack. His fingers trembled slightly as he fitted into the lock. With a click, the door swung open. Inside was a single battered cardboard box. Jamal hesitated only a second before pulling it out, placing it carefully on the floor. He and Thomas knelt beside it as he lifted the lid. Inside, they found a collection of Gloria's past. Photographs, old letters, documents, and at the very bottom, a second envelope. Jamal's breath hitched as he recognized the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to him. Gloria's last words. Jamal's hand shook as he tore the envelope open. His heart pounded against his ribs as he unfolded the letter inside. Thomas watched silently as the boy's eyes moved over the words, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally to something raw and painful. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Jamal read aloud, "Jamal, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every lie, for every secret, for every question you had that I never answered. But the truth isn't easy, and some truths can destroy us." Jamal swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the page. "You've always asked about your father. I wanted to tell you. I did, but I couldn't, because the man you think is your father isn't, and the man who really is your father." Jamal's voice caught. He blinked rapidly, his entire body tensing, as he forced himself to continue. "I never wanted you to know him." Silence filled the basement. Jamal's breathing was uneven, his shoulders stiff. He looked up at Thomas, his eyes dark with emotion. She didn't mean you," Jamal said, his voice shaking. "She meant John," Thomas finished grimly. "His brother." Jamal turned back to the letter, his hands gripping the page as though it might slip away. His mother's words continued. "John Alcott was not a good man, Jamal. He was dangerous. He was cruel. And he wasn't the father you deserved. So I lied. I told you Thomas was your father, because I needed you to believe in something good. I needed you to have hope. I needed you to grow up thinking your father was a man worth looking up to." Tears burned in Jamal's eyes. He clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "She lied to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She lied." Thomas's chest ached at the sight of him. "She lied to protect you," he said gently. Jamal let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And now, what am I supposed to do with this? How am I supposed to?" His voice broke. Thomas took a steady breath, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We find him." Jamal snapped his head up. "What?" Thomas's expression was grim. "John faked his death. He ran. But he's alive. And we need to find him." Jamal's hands curled into fists. "And then what?" Thomas met his gaze with quiet determination. "Then we make him answer for what he's done." The hunt begins. Back in Thomas's study, the weight of Gloria's letter sat between them like an unspoken burden. Thomas flipped through the documents from the box, searching for anything that might lead them to John. Then he found it, a marriage certificate. His breath caught as he saw the name on the paper. Jonathan Alcott and Gloria Carter. "She married him," Thomas muttered. Jamal's head snapped up. "What?" Thomas slid the paper across the desk. "Your mother. She was legally married to John." Jamal's face twisted with disgust. "She never told me." Thomas studied the document carefully. The marriage lasted less than a year. Then, she disappeared. Jamal scoffed. "I wonder why." Thomas continued flipping through the documents. Receipts, old bank statements, rental agreements. Then he stopped. A paper trail. Withdrawals. Payments. An account that had been drained just weeks before John's so-called death. Jamal leaned over. "What is that?" "A pattern," Thomas murmured. Gloria was running, but John, he was planning something. He reached for his laptop, quickly typing in the account number. A few minutes later, his breath hitched. A recent transaction. From an account under the name James Anderson. Jamal frowned. Who's that? Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line. John. Jamal's eyes widened. He's alive. Yes, Thomas said. And I know exactly where to find him. A reckoning awaits. The air was heavy as Thomas closed the laptop. Jamal stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides. Where is he? The boy asked. Thomas exhaled. Pine Ridge, a small town 3 states over. He's been hiding there for years. Jamal's voice was steel. Then we go. Thomas hesitated. This isn't just some road trip, Jamal. If John is alive, he's not going to be happy to see us. He's dangerous. I don't care, Jamal snapped. I need to see him. I need him to look me in the eye and explain why he left. Why he hurt my mom. Why? He stopped, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Thomas placed a firm hand on his shoulder. If we do this, we do it right. We gather evidence. We bring the police. We make sure he never hurts anyone again. Jamal's breathing slowed. He nodded. Fine. Thomas took a deep breath. In all his years on the bench, he had judged criminals, sentenced men to prison, and upheld the law. But this was different. This was personal. And soon, Jonathan Alcott would face his reckoning. The road to reckoning. The long highway stretched out before them. A ribbon of asphalt slicing through the barren landscape. Judge Thomas Alcott sat behind the wheel, his fingers tight around the steering wheel as he stole a glance at the teenager in the passenger seat. Jamal was silent, staring out the window, his hood pulled up over his head. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. The weight of the last 24 hours hung heavy between them. Gloria's letter, the revelation of John's survival, and the undeniable truth that had brought them here. John Alcott was alive, and they were going to find him. The GPS guided them further into Pine Ridge, a small town 3 states over, a place John had thought would keep him hidden. Thomas had spent his life following the law, believing in it, but for the first time in decades, he wasn't here as a judge. He was here as a brother, as a father figure, as a man seeking justice. Jamal shifted in his seat. How much longer? Not long now, Thomas murmured. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Jamal exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers against the armrest. So what's the plan? We just roll up and knock on the door. Hey, John, long time no see. Wanna explain why you abandoned your kid and faked your own death? Thomas smirked despite himself. Not exactly. Jamal didn't laugh. His eyes were sharp, filled with something darker. What if he runs? What if he lies? What if he? He won't get the chance, Thomas assured him. I have a contact with the local sheriff's office. Once we confirm it's him, we'll bring them in. Jamal nodded but said nothing. Thomas knew what the boy really wanted to ask. What if he refuses to acknowledge me? What if he looks me in the eye and sees nothing? Thomas reached over and squeezed Jamal's shoulder. No matter what happens, you won't be alone in this. Jamal didn't reply, but for the first time, his shoulders didn't seem quite so tense. The ghost in the hardware store. Pine Ridge was a town frozen in time. A single main street, a few scattered buildings, and a population that likely knew each other's secrets. Thomas pulled up outside Anderson's Hardware, a small shop tucked between a diner and a gas station. The sign above the door was weathered, but the store was still in business. This is it, Thomas said. Jamal swallowed hard. He really thought he could disappear and be some regular guy, huh? His voice was tight with emotion, like none of it ever happened. People like John always think they can outrun their past, Thomas muttered. They always think they're smarter than everyone else. Jamal scoffed. Yeah, well, he's about to find out he's not. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching against the gravel parking lot. As they approached the glass door, Thomas noticed the closed for lunch sign hanging in the window. Jamal peered inside, his breath fogging up the glass. I see someone moving in the back. Thomas's pulse quickened. Then, the door creaked open. A man stepped into view. Older, weathered, but unmistakable. John Alcott. Jamal inhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides. For a moment, time stood still. John's eyes flicked between them, confusion giving way to something colder. He took a slow step back, his body language already screaming flight. Thomas spoke first. "Long time, John." John exhaled through his nose, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, in a voice thick with something unreadable, he said, "You shouldn't be here." Jamal took a sharp step forward. "And you shouldn't be alive." The words cut through the air like a blade. John's gaze settled on the boy, studying him with an unreadable expression. "You got your mother's eyes," he muttered barely above a whisper. Jamal's fists tightened. "Yeah, you wouldn't know. You weren't there." John didn't respond. Thomas took a step inside the store, forcing John to stay put. "We know everything," he said. "The fraud, the debts, the staged accident. You ran, John. You left your son and Gloria to fend for themselves." John scoffed, running a hand through his graying hair. "So what? You gonna drag me back and play hero, Tom? You always did love that role." Thomas's patience snapped. "This isn't about me. This is about him." He gestured to Jamal. "This is about the fact that you left your own child to suffer while you built a new life for yourself." John's expression flickered, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "I wasn't fit to be a father," he muttered. "I did what was best." Jamal laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You did what was best. Best for who? You? Mom worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table while you were out here playing house in some backwater town." John's jaw clenched. "She knew what I was." "Yeah," Jamal snapped, his voice shaking. "She did. That's why she ran." John looked away, his fingers tapping against the countertop. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he said under his breath. Thomas stepped closer. "You say you weren't fit to be a father, but you still let her carry the weight of your failures. You didn't even check in. Not once. You just disappeared." John's eyes darkened. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Thomas shot back. "And you made yours." Jamal exhaled sharply, his body trembling with pent-up rage. "Why didn't you ever try? Why didn't you?" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Why didn't you even want to know me?" John finally met his son's gaze, and what Jamal saw there broke something inside him. Because there was no remorse, no regret, no longing. Just emptiness. Jamal took a slow step back. "You really don't care, do you?" John sighed. "Kid, I don't." Jamal cut him off. His voice was quieter now, but the weight behind it was crushing. "I don't want to hear excuses." John hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Then Thomas saw it. The moment John realized the walls were closing in, his eyes flickered toward the door. His stance shifted slightly. Thomas reacted instantly. "Don't even think about running." John's hands clenched. "What are you gonna do, Tom? Arrest me? You don't have that power." "No," Thomas admitted, "but the sheriff does." Right on cue, the sound of sirens pierced the air. John's eyes widened. "You called the cops." His voice finally held something close to real emotion. Panic. "You bet your ass I did," Thomas said. The doors burst open as uniformed officers flooded in, weapons drawn. Jonathan Alcott, the lead officer, called. "You're under arrest for fraud, evasion, and multiple outstanding warrants." John's expression twisted in fury. "Damn you, Tom." Thomas didn't flinch. "You did this to yourself." As the officers cuffed him, John struggled, his voice growing frantic. "This isn't over. You think this makes you better than me. You think this erases everything." Jamal stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice steady and unshaken, he said, "It does for me." John stilled. Then, with one last venomous glare at Thomas, he let the officers drag him away. The room fell into silence. Jamal exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Jamal didn't respond right away. Then, finally, "I will be." And for the first time since this all began, Thomas believed him. The weight of the past. The hardware store smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint scent of motor oil. Now, with John Alcott dragged away in handcuffs, the tension that had suffocated the air finally began to lift, but only slightly. Jamal stood still, staring at the empty space where his father had been just moments ago. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, his fists still clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. Thomas studied him carefully. This was the moment that mattered. Not the arrest. Not John's pathetic excuses. But this. The aftermath. The part where Jamal would have to decide who he was going to be now. "You don't have to stay here," Thomas said, breaking the silence. Jamal blinked as if snapping out of a trance. "What?" Thomas motioned toward the door. "You don't have to watch them take him away. You've already faced him. That's enough." Jamal hesitated, his shoulders rigid with an unreadable emotion. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "No," he said. "I want to see it." Thomas nodded. Together, they stepped outside, the cool evening air settling over them like a thin blanket. Closure, or something like it. The police cars were lined up along the curb, their flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the surrounding buildings. A small crowd had gathered. Locals who had probably known John as James Anderson, the quiet man who ran the hardware store. Not Jonathan Alcott, the fraud, the criminal, the man who had left behind a wife and child to fend for themselves. Jamal stepped closer, his gaze locked onto the police cruiser where John sat in the back seat, hands cuffed behind his back. His father's expression was unreadable, his face partially shadowed by the reflection of the red and blue lights. Jamal took another step forward. John's gaze flicked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was silence. A pause. A single heartbeat where the world shrank down to just them. John opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jamal didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. And that was when John finally looked away. Not in anger. Not in defiance. But in shame. Jamal exhaled, his body relaxing ever so slightly. "That's it, huh?" he muttered. "That's all he's got." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's not the man you needed him to be, Jamal. And he never was." Jamal swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His eyes burned, but no tears came. "He never even asked if I was okay," Jamal said quietly. "Not once." Thomas's grip on his shoulder tightened, because he never deserved to. Jamal inhaled deeply, then took a step back. "Yeah," he said, his voice firmer. "Yeah, I think I get that now." The officers slammed the door shut. John was officially gone. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Jamal didn't feel like the one left behind. A different kind of goodbye. The drive back to the hotel was silent. Jamal sat with his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the streetlights blur past. Thomas let him be. The kid needed time to process, to let everything settle. When they finally pulled into the parking lot, Jamal let out a long breath. "You really meant it, huh?" he said. Thomas turned off the engine. "Meant what?" Jamal looked over at him. "That I don't have to do this alone." Thomas held his gaze. "Yeah, I meant it." Jamal nodded, his expression unreadable. "Okay," he said, voice softer than usual. "Okay." They stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around them. As they walked toward their rooms, Jamal hesitated outside his door. "Hey, thanks," he muttered. Thomas turned to him, brow slightly raised. "For what?" Jamal shifted on his feet, glancing away. "For coming with me. For, you know." not letting me face him alone. Thomas's lips pressed together. "You're not alone, Jamal," he said. "Not anymore." Jamal swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I believe that now." For the first time, Thomas saw it, the weight that had been dragging the boy down for so long finally starting to lift. And maybe, just maybe, they were both finally ready to move forward. Together, the aftermath of truth. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, bathing the small town of Pine Ridge in soft gold. The previous night had been a storm of emotions, but now, in the quiet of dawn, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle. Inside the small motel room, Jamal lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had thought that facing his father would bring closure, that it would make the pain disappear, make the years of wondering, of not knowing, suddenly make sense. But it didn't. If anything, it left him feeling emptier. John hadn't even fought for him, hadn't even tried to make an excuse, hadn't even cared. Jamal turned on his side, his jaw clenched. So why did it still hurt so damn much? There was a knock at the door. He hesitated for a moment before getting up and opening it. Judge Thomas Alcott stood there, holding 2 coffee cups and a brown paper bag. "I figured you didn't eat much last night," he said. "Got you something." Jamal blinked, glancing at the bag. "What is it?" Thomas smirked. "A completely unhealthy amount of pancakes." Jamal's stomach growled, but he rolled his eyes. "You bribing me with food now?" "Bribing? No. Convincing. Maybe." Jamal huffed, stepping aside. "Fine. Come in." The weight of questions. The two of them sat at the small motel table, the scent of syrup and coffee filling the room. Jamal picked at his food, pushing the pancakes around on his plate before finally speaking. "So, what now?" Thomas took a slow sip of coffee. "That depends on you." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've spent your whole life running," Thomas said. "First with your mom, then after she was gone. Now you don't have to run anymore. But you have to decide. What do you want?" Jamal stared down at his plate, his appetite suddenly gone. "I don't know." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "That's okay. You don't have to figure it all out right now." Jamal sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, but I feel like I should. Like I thought finally seeing him would make things clear. But it just..." He clenched his fists, searching for the right words. "It just made me realize how much I don't know what to do next." Thomas set his coffee down. "You don't have to let him define you, Jamal." Jamal looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "Then who am I supposed to be?" Thomas studied him for a moment. "Who do you want to be?" Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "That's the thing. I never thought past this. My whole life was about surviving. I never stopped to think about after." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then let's start small." Jamal raised a brow. "Small? Yeah, one step at a time. What's one thing you want for yourself right now?" Jamal hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he muttered, "I want to finish school." Thomas smiled. "Then that's where we start." The choice ahead, the ride back to the city, was quieter than the ride there, but not in the same tense, suffocating way. This silence was different, a silence of processing, of figuring out what came next. By the time they pulled into Thomas's driveway, Jamal had his arms crossed, deep in thought. Thomas parked the car and turned to him. "You don't have to decide today, but I need you to know, you're not alone in this, Jamal. Whatever you choose, I'll be here." Jamal stared out the window, his voice hesitant. "Why?" Thomas blinked. "Why what? Why do you care so much?" Jamal's fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. "I mean, I get why my mom lied. She wanted me to believe I had a better dad than I did. But why are you still here? Why do you keep trying?" Thomas exhaled. He had asked himself the same question more times than he could count. The truth was, Jamal mattered. Because Gloria had seen something in him, had trusted him enough to name him in her last breath. Because John had walked away, and someone needed to stay. Because even if he wasn't Jamal's father, he wanted to be the man the kid needed. So he looked Jamal in the eye and said the only thing that felt right. Because family isn't just about blood. Jamal held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he stepped out of the car. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to believe it. New beginnings. Days turned into weeks. Jamal stayed. At first, he barely spoke. He spent most of his time in the spare room Thomas had set up for him, or outside shooting hoops in the driveway. But little by little, things started to shift. They built a routine. Breakfast in the morning. Discussions about school. The occasional sarcastic jab from Jamal, which Thomas took as a good sign. It wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others. Some nights, Thomas could hear Jamal pacing in his room, restless, still haunted by the weight of everything he had lost. But the important thing, he wasn't running anymore. One afternoon, as Thomas sat in his study reading over a case file, Jamal appeared in the doorway. "Hey," he muttered, shifting awkwardly. Thomas glanced up. "Hey." Jamal cleared his throat, shoving his hands into his pockets. I signed up for that GED program." Thomas set his papers down. "You did?" "Yeah." Jamal scratched the back of his neck. "Figured I might as well do something right." Thomas smiled. "I think that's a great idea." Jamal hesitated. You really think I can do this?" Thomas stood, walking over to place a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jamal, I know you can." For the first time in a long time, Jamal smiled. Not a smirk. Not a bitter, forced grin. A real, genuine smile. And for the first time since that day in the courtroom, Thomas knew they were going to be okay. A father in every way that mattered. Months passed. Jamal kept his promise. He worked, he studied, and with each passing day, he became stronger. And through it all, Thomas stayed. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jamal turned to Thomas. "You know," he said, "Mom wasn't wrong about you." Thomas raised a brow. "Oh." Jamal smirked. "She said you were a good man." Thomas's chest tightened, his voice softer than usual. "I'm just trying to do right by her." Jamal nodded, looking out at the sky. "Yeah, I think you have." They sat in silence for a moment. Then, Jamal took a deep breath and said, "I know you're not my dad, but you kinda feel like one." Thomas's throat tightened. He didn't need to say anything. Instead, he simply reached over and ruffled Jamal's hair, earning a playful shove in return. Jamal grinned. "Don't get all soft on me now, old man." Thomas chuckled. Too late. And just like that, the weight of the past no longer seemed so heavy. Because they had each other. And that was enough. The meaning of family. The months that followed were not perfect. Healing never came in a straight line. Jamal had good days. Days when he laughed easily, when his sarcastic wit kept Thomas on his toes, when he didn't seem weighed down by the past. But there were also bad days. Days when he retreated into himself, when the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Days when Thomas found him awake at odd hours of the night, staring out the window as if expecting someone to drag him back into the life he had left behind. But no one was coming for him. Because, for the first time in his life, he was safe. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. Falling into place. Jamal's GED classes had become a routine. At first, he had resisted, dragging his feet, mumbling complaints, acting as though it wasn't worth the effort. But deep down, Thomas could tell the kid wanted this. He wanted to prove to himself, and maybe even to his mother's memory, that he could build something better. So Thomas supported him, driving him to and from his classes, sitting across the kitchen table at night, flipping through study guides, helping him prepare for his exams. And slowly, things shifted. Jamal began to believe in himself. One night, as they sat reviewing a particularly difficult section on algebra, Jamal let out a groan and pushed his book away. "Who even uses this crap in real life?" Thomas smirked. "People who like getting their taxes done correctly." Jamal narrowed his eyes. "You're not funny." "You're right," Thomas agreed. "I'm hilarious." Jamal huffed but didn't hide the smirk that tugged at his lips. Moments like these were small, but they mattered. Because they weren't just working towards something. They were building something. Something stronger than blood. A name that meant something. The day Jamal took his GED exam, Thomas had been more nervous than him. They sat in the car outside the testing center, the sky a mix of blue and gold as the sun set behind them. "You ready?" Thomas asked. Jamal exhaled, bouncing his leg. "I don't know." Thomas studied him for a moment. "Do you want me to come inside with you?" Jamal hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I got this." Thomas smiled. "I know you do." And for the first time, Jamal believed it too. The call that changed everything. A week later, Jamal's test results arrived. Thomas had been in his office, reviewing case files, when he heard the sound of rapid footsteps followed by an excited yo. Jamal burst into the study, waving the letter in his hands. "I passed." Thomas grinned. "I never had a doubt." Jamal scoffed. "Dude, you were the one pacing the night before my test." Thomas didn't deny it. "Okay, fine. Maybe a little." Jamal smirked. "A little? You looked like you were preparing for a Supreme Court trial." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm proud of you, Jamal." The words hit differently this time. Jamal's smirk faded, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Thanks," he said quietly. And Thomas knew. This wasn't just about passing a test. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't trapped in the life John had left behind. He was more than his past, more than his father's abandonment, more than his mother's struggles. He was his own person, and he had a future. The adoption conversation. One evening, Thomas was organizing some legal paperwork when he found himself staring at a blank document he had left untouched for weeks. A guardianship request. His fingers traced over the edge of the paper as he exhaled slowly. Did he have the right to do this? To ask this of Jamal? Jamal was 15, not a little kid, not someone who needed to be saved. But he was still a boy without a home, without a name that felt like his own. Thomas had never had children of his own. He had never expected to. But Jamal had changed that. This wasn't about obligation. This wasn't about responsibility. This was about family. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stood up and walked toward the living room, where Jamal was flipping through channels on the TV. "Got a second?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm. Jamal shot him a look. "Depends. If this is about my math homework, I plead the fifth." Thomas smirked but sat down beside him, holding out the paperwork. Jamal frowned, taking it. "What's this?" "Guardianship," Thomas said. "If you want, I can make this official." Jamal stared at the papers, his fingers gripping the edges. You want to be my legal guardian. Only if you want me to be." Jamal hesitated. Thomas could see the battle in his eyes, the hesitation, the walls that had been built over years of being let down, of learning not to trust too easily. But then, slowly, cautiously, Jamal exhaled. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I do." A new beginning. Months passed. The paperwork was filed. The judge approved the guardianship. And just like that, Jamal had a home. A real home. A place that wasn't just another shelter, another temporary stop. And for the first time in his life, a father figure who wasn't just a name in the distance. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Jamal cleared his throat. "You ever think about adopting?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas raised a brow. You mean officially? Jamal shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I dunno. Just thought I'd ask. Thomas studied him for a long moment before nodding. If that's something you want, we can talk about it. Jamal smirked, kicking a loose rock on the pavement. Would that mean I have to call you Dad? Thomas chuckled. I don't know. Would you? Jamal snorted. Yeah, not happening. Thomas grinned. I can live with that. Jamal rocked back on his heels. Cool. Just figured I'd ask. Thomas saw it, the silent message beneath the words. Jamal didn't need to say it outright. He already knew. He had already chosen his family, and in the end, that was all that mattered. 1 year later, Jamal stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He had never been one for formal wear, but today was different. Today, he was walking across a stage to receive his diploma. He glanced at the small photo sitting on his dresser, a picture of his mother, smiling. Did it, Mom? He murmured. The bedroom door cracked open, and Thomas poked his head in. You ready? Jamal smirked. Think I have a choice? Nope. Jamal rolled his eyes but followed Thomas outside. As they drove to the graduation ceremony, Thomas glanced at Jamal, pride filling his chest. You nervous? He asked. Jamal shrugged. Nah, not really. Thomas smiled. You should be proud of yourself. Jamal glanced out the window. Yeah, I think she would have been proud too. Thomas nodded. She would have. As they pulled up to the venue, Jamal hesitated, then said, Hey, thanks. For what? For sticking around, Jamal muttered. For not giving up on me. Thomas's grip on the wheel tightened. Never, kid. And he meant it. Because this was family. Not because of blood. Not because of obligation. But because in the end, they chose each other. And that was enough.